Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Tuesday, October 1st. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Coming up, a Visalia native had a front row seat to Republican politics for decades.
The fundamental elements of the party hasn't changed at all. People ask me, am I a Trump Republican? And I say, no, I'm a Ken Khachigian Republican.
Ken Khachigian discusses his experience serving under Presidents Nixon and Reagan. But first, today's headlines. A former leader of a Merced and Fresno County water district will not face jail time for conspiring to steal federally owned water. The Fresno Bee reports Dennis Valachi was sentenced Monday to 5 years probation for the crimes, to which he pleaded guilty in May. Valachi used to oversee the Pinoche Water District on the west side of the valley. He previously admitted to stealing up to $3.5 million worth of public water and filing a false tax return. UC Kern. If that sounded impossible before, it's now much closer to reality. One of several bills Governor Gavin Newsom has signed into law this session includes one that establishes an endowment fund to support a UC medical school campus in Kern County. The effort was spearheaded by freshman Assemblymember Jasmeet Bains, though plans for a UC campus in Kern County have been in the works for more than a decade. Newsom said in his signing message that the Central Valley is in need of support to expand medical education. A drug trafficking ring revealed in 2022 in Fresno has now led to multiple guilty verdicts. KVPR's Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado reports on the latest and final verdict in the investigation.
Federal prosecutors say a 23-year-old Fresno woman pleaded guilty to several drug charges. She's among 19 others who have either pleaded guilty or have been found guilty by a jury as part of a wide-ranging investigation. It was sparked by a surge of fentanyl-related overdoses in the county and led to the arrest of a man at the center of it, known as the M30 King of Fresno. The name references counterfeit oxycodone pills that were laced with fentanyl and had been distributed from Mexico into California and other states. Investigators tracked the drug ring to the valley as far back as 2021 and intercepted packages that were then mailed out of state. The CDC says synthetic opioids like fentanyl are the leading cause of overdose deaths right now in the U.S. For KVPR News, I'm Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado.
Governor Gavin Newsom has signed a bill limiting where warehouses can expand across the state. Assembly Bill 98 got opposition from unlikely groups, but supporters say the bill's needed to curb pollution near communities. The law will require that warehouses be at least 300 to 500 feet from residential properties, depending on the neighborhood's zoning. Areas of the state that have seen the biggest increases in warehouse expansions include the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. A racehorse had to be euthanized following an injury it got on the track at the Big Fresno Fairgrounds. The incident happened on Sunday, on one of the 14 days of live racing this year. It's the most the fairgrounds has ever offered. Fair officials told local news outlets the 5-year-old female horse, named Crimea Runner, stumbled on the track and was euthanized due to the severity of her injuries. Officials said it's extremely rare to lose a horse at the Fresno racetrack, but racehorse deaths have been a point of controversy at other tracks in the state. The Big Fresno Fair officially kicks off tomorrow.
Vice presidential candidates Tim Walz and J.D. Vance are set to face off in their very first debate on Tuesday, October 1st. KVPR will broadcast the debate live on the radio at kvpr.org and on the KVPR app. If you're in Fresno, you can also join us in person for a watch party at Me and Ed's on Tap in the Tower District. The debate starts at 6, but arrive at 5 to get a seat and play some politics-themed trivia. Learn more at kvpr.org/events.
And now to our main story, the resignation of President Richard Nixon, the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, the 2000 presidential campaign of John McCain. To all of these events and more, Ken Khachigian had a front row seat. In his new book, Behind Closed Doors, Khachigian, who grew up in Visalia, specifically examines his time serving under Presidents Reagan and Nixon. Khachigian recently sat down with our producer, Jonathan Linden. He talked about how his Visalia upbringing shaped his worldview.
You certainly create a big work ethic growing up in the valley, especially on a farm. starting with driving a tractor at age 6 and being one. I had 3 brothers. I was the youngest brother, and we were a very good source of cheap labor for Dad at the vineyard and orchard where we had 60 acres in Visalia. And it does create an extraordinary work ethic. And you do have a little different worldview of what struggle is like, depending upon the crops every year.
Ken, in your new book, Behind Closed Doors, you chronicle the early years of your career when you were working in President Nixon's office, and you were actually with his office when he resigned, and you actually spent time with him after he left office and returned to California. What stood out to you about Nixon in those days?
Well, initially, I would say there were several moments that stood out. One was right after his resignation when I first came out to California to help him out, and that was when everything had been taken away from him. He had lost the presidency and the most precious thing up to that moment that he had had in his professional life. And I arrived at the compound and I sat down with him. He had no job. He had no income. He had massive debts. They were trying to get him on back taxes. They were trying to disbar him in California and New York. There were subpoenas floating around. And I sat down with him as the first opportunities I had to meet face to face. And I was 29 years old, and I thought my life was ended. I thought my life was ended. And of course, his metaphorically was ended. And I thought he would be depressed and dejected. And I was sitting in front of him, and he insisted to me, said, "Ken, don't get down. We have to look forward. We can't look back. We have to move ahead. So I don't want you to feel down right now. We can't sit back and look at what happened and obsess about it. We have to look ahead and move forward." And I thought that was one of the great lessons in life.
You would later go on to serve briefly as White House chief speechwriter for President Ronald Reagan, but continued to write speeches for him off and on throughout his presidency. When you were writing for President Reagan, what was your process and how did you approach those speeches?
The initial approach would be, if we had time, would be to sit down with President Reagan and get his thoughts on the speech, to make sure he was briefed on what the organization was or what the occasion was, and then try to get some advanced thoughts. I would always prepare ahead of time. If it was a State of the Union, if it was a convention, the GOP convention, or if it was a speech before the UN General Assembly, I would make sure I did my homework and go in, not waste his time, and give him here's my ideas on some of the things you might want to say. I never tried to impose on him what I thought the policy should be, but only some thoughts on what he might think about. And then if he had some ideas, he'd feed back to me. So then I would try to prepare a draft for him to try to connect him to whatever the audience was. So the process went like that, but there was never a great back and forth. Once he got it and put his own imprint on it, I didn't do a lot of questioning unless there was a factual issue.
So you've had a front row seat to Republican politics now off and on for over 5 decades. In this conversation, you've talked a little bit about your time with Nixon and Reagan. You were even the California campaign coordinator for John McCain during his 2000 presidential bid. How would you say the party has evolved over that time, with former President Donald Trump now being the party's leader?
The fundamental elements of the party hasn't changed at all. I know people ask me that all the time. People ask me, am I a Trump Republican? And I say, no, I'm a Ken Khachigian Republican, because the fundamental notions of the party are basic. And that is, the party believes in lower taxes rather than higher taxes. It believes in less government rather than more government. It believes in a strong national defense rather than a weaker national defense. So the fundamentals of the party have not changed. And the different personalities who have led the top of the party over the years have put their different imprint on the leadership of the party.
That was Ken Khachigian speaking with our producer, Jonathan Linden. Khachigian's new book, Behind Closed Doors, explores his time serving in the Reagan and Nixon administrations. And that does it for today. Thanks for listening. If you have feedback or a story idea, we'd love to hear from you. Email podcast@kvpr.org. Today's episode was produced by Jonathan Linden and KVPR with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.